If you're in need of animal crackers, there's your group. Yep, I knew that. Okay. We have the honor and privilege of having Justin Culp here with us today. Let me just reiterate this. There are envelopes out there. They say pioneers on them. Yep, you'll put that on. Appreciate it. And then turn it on. We're not too technical here. But if you would, and then, or take an envelope home with you, because this is ongoing. I know he comes today to remind us he's out there, but it's a month from now, it's 3 months from now, it's 6 months from now. If you could participate, and if you can there's a little slip of paper in there, if you put your name and address and your email, then he'll stay in touch with you. And then any amounts to make it to Pioneers, there's a slip of paper, it already has his name on it, so if you'll fill out that little piece of paper that's in the envelope, it would be most helpful. All right. We met Justin, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that. You were at Calvary, or just coming out of Calvary. And he called one day and said, "Can I come to your church?" And I said, "No." And he came anyway. No, sure. And then he called me recently. He was going to come in January, but we were just coming out of our mess here with the loss of Sherry and then Darlene. And I said, "Yeah, I would wait." And here we are. And I was really bad about getting in touch with him, so he knows that. But we were going through a lot as a church. So anyway, he's here today, Justin Culp. Is it going to work?
It's already on.
It's on. Yay! And it works.
It works.
Where you want to be. You can be anywhere you want.
I'll go up there.
Okay.
I was just waiting for him to get done talking.
You know, you could wait for days for that to happen.
I was going to say we might be here till next week.
That's right, between the two of us. All right. Anyway, welcome, Justin Culp.
He says he's hard to get a hold of. There's a pastor in Peculiar that I won't name because we're really close to Peculiar that told me he was going to call me back in a couple weeks, like 8 months ago, and I've been calling him 3 times a week for 8 months, and he won't answer his phone or call me back. So you're not that hard to get a hold of. I have a lot of funny stories. I probably just have to skip them. He said, I asked if I could come, and he said no, but I came anyways. I actually spoke at a church in Garnett, Kansas once where they invited me to come preach, but then found out that I wasn't carrying the right version of Bible. And so then he told me that I could have 5 minutes. And once he gave me the microphone, I just said everything I wanted to say. I drove 2.5 hours to get there, right? And so about 20 minutes later, I gave it back to him, and he never invited me back. So Clayton just triggered me, right? So I was here, I think the last time I was here wasn't here, it was there, and it was in 2016. So I looked a little bit different. I noticed the prayer cards that are out there are the old ones. When I was here last time, I think I weighed like 350 pounds, and a lot of people just don't recognize me, but that's another long story. A lot's happened in the last 6 years. Caleb's happened. He just turned 6, so I don't know if he was here last time I spoke to you guys or not. But I wanted to start, I'll introduce my family in a minute. I wanted to start by reading, it's always funny trying to get ready to come out and speak in churches because like I got to talk about what's going on in our family and ministry, but then it's like Sunday morning pulpit time, and so like how can I wrap a sermon around some of this other stuff, and like what's God teaching me from His Word right now? And so as I was thinking about what to say, I'd really been kind of looking at some of the people that God called throughout the Bible, and I wanted to read really quick just some of God's exchange with Moses in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. So I'm going to read Exodus 3, 10 through 14, and then a couple of places in chapter 4. You guys all know the story, right? Moses like killed somebody and ran off, and then one day there's a bush on fire, and God starts talking to him, and he's saying, "I'm going to send you back, and you're going to like lead your people out of Egypt and do all this great stuff." And Moses is like, "Not me, right?" And so I want to read part of that conversation. God says, "Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" And he said, "Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." It just occurred to me, I love that Moses is like, "Who am I? How am I going to do this?" And God says, "Well, here's your sign. When it's all over, you'll know," right? Have you been there before? Right. Okay. And then Moses said to God, "Behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, God your fathers has sent me to God, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you." Then I want to go down to the first verse of chapter 4. Moses said, "What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you." And they kind of go back and forth. And then at the end, in verse 10, Moses says to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in times past, nor since you've spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say." I love that passage. Nobody believes me anymore that I'm like the introvert in our family. Before I got saved when I was 20 years old. I grew up in Lawrence, and I was going to college at Johnson County and taking some programming classes, and all of a sudden, like, I was working 3 jobs, and all of a sudden at all 4, like 3 jobs and at school, people were sharing the gospel with me. So I walked into this Southern Baptist church, and I'll never forget that day because everyone's like standing up and singing, and it was really weird, right? Like my mom's Catholic, so we kind of went to church on Christmas and Easter, or at least said that we did. But even then it was different. Like, we're in this Baptist church and everyone's like singing and, you know, smiling and shaking hands, right? Greet your neighbor, right? And then the pastor got up to preach, and in the bulletin, I had that bulletin in my Bible for years. The title of the sermon was "Geological Proofs for a Universal Flood." So I fell asleep. And I remember I woke up because everyone was singing again, and I woke up and was like, oh man, like, I just slept through church and all these people saw me, and I was really kind of nervous and embarrassed, and everyone got up to leave, and there's all these people like crowded in the lobby, and I'm trying to just get through them and get out because I didn't want to talk to anybody. And the guy who was leading music actually stopped me in the lobby, and I was like, now I'm in trouble. Like, that dude saw me wake up in the middle of his song, you know, and so he introduced himself. He found out that I wasn't a KU student, which, you know, when a 20-year-old walks into your church randomly in Lawrence, you just assume they're a KU student. When he found out that I wasn't, and he said, "So what brings you here today?" I said, "Well, you know, I've been hearing all this stuff about like sin and Jesus and heaven and hell, and I was hoping someone would explain it to me." And so he took me in the office and locked the door and didn't let me out until I was a new creation in Christ. And then the church split at the business meeting that night, right? So I was kind of an anomaly. But why was I talking about that? This isn't in my notes. Moses is saying I don't talk very good, and I was just resonating with that. And so I actually the first time John, the guy that led me to Christ, is the guy who taught me how to preach, actually made me stand and preach just to him one time, and then he said, "Good, you're going to preach that on Sunday." This was Friday evening. He said, "Good, you're going to preach that on Sunday," and I actually had like a bucket right here in front of me just in case I got sick on stage. So I can really feel for Moses, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to introduce you to my family since it's been a while. I left my water all the way back there. My family. Thank you. So, this is my family. All right, next slide. Just kidding. So, my wife Amy and I met at Midwestern. There was this girl in my missions class that I was kind of talking to, and she told me she wasn't interested and introduced me to Amy, and so Amy and I were friends in seminary. I fixed her car and helped her move, and one day I told her that I was interested in her, and she said, "That's cool. We'll always be good friends." And so I left and went to South Sudan. And after a few months, she was talking to one of our mutual friends and said, "I never hear from Justin anymore." And that guy Luke said, "Well, yeah, you told him you weren't interested." And she said, "No, I told him I wanted to be friends." And he said, "No, that's not what those words mean." And so she wrote me an email while I'm in the bush in South Sudan and was like, "That's not what I meant," and we started talking on the phone again. And after a while, I asked her to come to South Sudan and kind of see what it was like, because I'd pretty much found like what I knew God was calling me to do, and wanted her to, see what she was in for. So I asked her to marry me, and she said, "Ask me again in a couple days." And so I waited a couple days and asked her again, and then we talked about it for a couple hours, and then she said yes. And so she came home and started planning a wedding, and I came home 6 months later, and we got married, and these two things happened. So in our tribe in South Sudan, naming is a really interesting thing. So what are your kids' names? He doesn't remember.
Yeah, well, we've had 27 of them.
Okay, name a couple of them. Matthew, Amber, Adam. 27? I feel like I can't believe anything he says. But, huh? Okay. Matthew, Amber, Adam. Did you name any of those kids?
Yes.
Okay.
Those three are ours.
Okay. How did you decide on the name Amber? Okay. Okay. So most of the time in America, we just sort of say, "Hey, that's a really cool name," or maybe there's like a family member or whatever. But your name really doesn't mean anything, right? It's just kind of what people call you. We spoke at a church in St. Louis, and we did their missions conference, and we spent the weekend staying with this man. He was 97 years old, and his name was Maynard Howell. And we were at his house sitting in his dining room, and my wife said, "Maynard, how did you come to know the Lord?" And he just lit up like a Christmas tree, and he spent the next 2 hours telling us this story. And he's talking about when he got saved at 18 years old, and I'm sitting there thinking this dude's been following Jesus longer than my grandparents have been alive. And so we talked to him like way into the night, and when Amy was pregnant with Caleb, our youngest, I said, I want to name our child after Maynard. And she said, I'm not naming my son Maynard. And I said, okay, how about middle name? And she said, okay, it can be his middle name, but we can never call him that. So you know what I did? I gave him a different middle name, and I just call him Maynard all the time. And he answers to Maynard better than he answers to his own name, and it's a nickname. So it's funny. She hates me for it, but so in South Sudan, in our tribe, naming is a little bit different. Most of the time, actually, there's a book on my table called They Poured Fire on Us from the Sky, and it's about some of the South Sudanese Lost Boys that came over here. Like George Bush started the Lost Boys program and brought these refugees and resettled them. Whenever you see like the big tall guy with really dark skin that works at Costco, he's South Sudanese. And they talked in that story about coming to the United States and how weird it was that like everyone just had one name. And people would say, what's your name? And like he didn't really know what to say because he's got like 17 of them, and depending on who he's talking to and what the context is. Most of the time, kids get a name when they're born based on what's happening around at the time. And so there are a lot of kids named dry season and rainy season, or planting or harvesting. Those are really common names. In our village, there's no electricity, no water. We're a bunch of mud and grass houses on the side of a mountain. Well, there was a South African cellular company called MTN that decided that they were going to come and like put a tower here and a tower here at the ends of the mountain range, and then they would put a repeater in the middle and point it at all the villages, and all of a sudden we were all going to have cell phone network, which would be like life-changing. So they came out and they cleared the place and they built the tower and they got it switched on, and the next day somebody from the tribe stole all the solar panels, and it's just been standing there dark ever since. And we never actually got cell phone network. But in that like 6-month period where everyone was excited about this thing that was moving in, there were 3 kids in our village named Development and 4 kids in our village named Network. Like the English word network was his name. So naming is a little bit different. And then as you get older and you do things, you learn hobbies, you develop character, you get more names kind of added on, and they're like nicknames except they become part of your name. And so there's a word in our language that's ebiola horo, and it literally means I got so drunk that I rolled down the mountain. And that's a common name in our village. Alcoholism is a huge problem, but so got drunk and rolled down the mountain is a name. There's names like anger or lost the fight. Right? How would you like to have that name? And so naming is different. So when we got to the village, so Ezekiel, my son, the one in front of my wife here, he's 9 years old now. We really wanted him to meet local children and learn the language and play with kids other than his brother. And so across the street was the primary school, and when they came out for recess, we would go over there with him, and he liked to just run and see who could run the fastest. Well, every year in our tribe, they do this festival to honor the village landlord. And the landlord means something different. Here it means he owns your house and you pay him rent, right? But in our tribe in South Sudan, the landlord is the guy who controls the land. So he's the one who blesses your harvest. And when the men go out hunting, there are certain rituals that he does. He's a really powerful person. There are name and date written accounts of people coming out and saying, last year we brought you all these gifts and the locusts still ate all of our sorghum, so I don't think we should give him anything this year. And the landlord says, I'm putting a curse on you and I'm going to send snakes to your house to bite you in your sleep and kill you. And then 2 days later it happens. Like we're here we talk about magic and like superstition, and it's kind of a funny thing, but in the part of the world where we've been living, we're talking about like real spiritual power and bondage and what we have to do in that situation. But so he's a powerful guy. And so every year they have this big festival where there's a lot of eating and drinking and dancing, and it goes on for like 6 or 7. I don't think anyone sleeps because it like keeps us awake all night, the drumming and everything, just through the night and day for 6 or 7 days. Well, at some point during that festival, the Lam, the landlord will gather up some ashes from the fire, and he sort of throws them in the air and blows the ashes out over this group of men, and then they all take off running. So we live in a mountain bowl. We're surrounded on 3.5 sides, and they'll run out the bowl into the bush to a particular tree where they break a branch off and run back with it, and the first person to get back to the meeting place with a branch from that tree just won the foot race. It's a race. And he gets a title added to his name, which is Opheja. And so, because Ezekiel, all he ever wanted to do was like see who could run fastest. That's what they named him. That's what the people in our village call him. The next day after the foot race, they have a big wrestling tournament. And so people from all of the villages in our tribe will come to one place, and they walk in with their, like, waving their flags, and they've got a champion from their village that's going to, represent them in the wrestling tournament. I was driving to town one day with Paul, the pastor I'm discipling, and a song came on the radio. I just had like 3,000 songs on shuffle. And this country song came on that had to do with like, my friends who live in town think that they're better than me, but when everything goes sideways, I'm the one who knows how to survive. And so some people know the song, right? And so Paul was asking me, what's this song about? And I explained it to him, and he said, oh yeah, we have songs like that too. Like people move off to town and go to school and think that they're all educated and better than us, but they don't know how to grow their own food anymore. And then later we were talking about the wrestling tournament that happens during the Lam, and he said, yeah, they come in and they'll sing songs about how strong their man is, but then they'll also sing songs about all the other guys and their mothers. And so I found out in one day that Low Pete people have country music and mama jokes. And so, but they have this big wrestling tournament, and at the end of the tournament, the guy who wins gets the title Otir. And within 2 weeks of being in this tribe, that's the name that they gave me. Last time I was here, I weighed 360 pounds, and when I got there, like everyone looked at me and just wanted to wrestle and like see who could do it. And it's different here. You pin people and stuff. In Sudan, wrestling is just takedowns. The first person to hit the ground loses. And so when you weigh 300 pounds and everyone else, it wasn't really a challenge. And so so I got that Otir as part of my name. So that's my son Opheja, I'm Otir. And then my wife, Amy, her name is the English word lion. And I'll get in trouble if I explain why. Not really. The Lopete word for lion is Amie, and so they thought we were just butchering the Lopete word like every other white person does, and that her real name was actually Lion, and so now everyone just calls her Lion, but she's Puerto Rican and it kind of fits. So, and then Caleb, who I'm holding in this picture, he just turned 6. His name is Oyeyer, which is the Lopete word for danger. I don't have time to tell all those stories. So that's my family. I lost track of where I was. Okay, so when I first went to South Sudan, I have 2 little boys that like being read to. We lived in a place with no TV. We would let them like watch a movie on the laptop, but that was a big deal. And so most of the time, like if they found out that you're the kind of person that would read a book to them, every time you'd come over to our house, you know, they'd walk up to you like this. And they just like being read to. And I like reading. I like reading books with lots of adventure and battles. And, you know, I'm a sucker for a good hero story. And it kind of frustrates my kids because I'm also an orality guy. Do you guys know what orality is? When we go into the villages, we can't just stand up and preach like a 5-point, nicely alliterated sermon like your pastor probably does. You know, that's a very literate way to communicate truth. And so in a whole tribe of people that have never read a word on paper in their life, like you categorize things in your mind differently, you process truth differently. And so what we do is we tell a story, and then from that story we ask a lot of questions to sort of draw out the truths. Our culture is quickly becoming a non-literate culture, which means even though we can read, we don't, and prefer to watch things on TV instead, or that kind of thing. But it's really hard for me to read a story to my kids without like stopping and saying, hey, what do we learn from this? You know, it's almost as bad as being a preacher's kid, I think. But because, you know, I'll stop halfway through the chapter and try to talk about what just happened. And Ezekiel, last night we were reading Lord of the Rings, and he just like grabbed the book out of my hand and stuck it in my face and said, keep reading, you know? But it seems like the best stories I read to my kids are stories where the weak sort of nobody becomes the brave hero, right? The Hobbit is the one who can carry the ring to Mordor. One time I was talking to a bunch of Dinka men. I guess I should show you my Dinka slide. One time I was talking to a bunch of these guys who were basically fighting over who was going to be the greatest. And I asked them a question. I asked them this question. I said, if I tie a chain to the back of my truck and I rip that mahogany tree out of the ground, you would say that's a really strong truck, right? And they said, yeah, that's a strong truck. And I said, so if I tie that same chain to my bicycle and I rip that mahogany tree out of the ground, you would say, that's really a strong guy, isn't it? And they said, yeah, right. You got to be strong to rip a tree out of the ground with a bicycle. And I said, good. So if you understand the gospel and you want to fit in God's economy, you get to be the bicycle. In 2010, before Amy and I got married, I went to South Sudan to work in the Dinka cattle camps. Cattle camp is a whole bunch of guys that live out in the middle of the bush and just take care of the family's cattle. So in the tribe, you've got educated people who like live in town and they're growing sorghum and having jobs and teaching in the primary schools. But every family will pick one or two of the boys that they think are the strongest and send them to cattle camp. And cows are really, really important in this culture. Like in order for you to get married, you've got to have cows to pay for your wife. And most of these guys have like 3 or 4 wives because they want to have as many sons as possible. But that means that other tribes are always coming also and trying to steal your cows. So instead of keeping the cows close to the village where the women and children are, they'll take them out in the bush and they kind of roam around and they're nomadic. And they're pretty rough guys. I've got some good pictures of cattle keepers just to give you an idea of who we were living with. So me and another guy went out to cattle camp and were like staying in tents and telling these guys Bible stories and sharing the gospel with them. My first day in cattle camp, we were looking for the guy who was in charge of the camp so we could ask for permission to be there, and he found me. He's about 6'8" and walks up and he's looking at me all angry. Dinkas are like the tallest people in the world. Manute Bol used to be the tallest center in the NBA, and he was a Dinka. And so this guy, you know, he looks like this, and he's about this tall, and he walks up and he starts yelling at me in Dinka, and the pastor's over here translating, and he's getting all scared, and the guy's like, "What are you doing in my camp? I didn't tell you could be here." And I knew a little bit about them before I went, and so I just kind of took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry if you feel like I've imposed, but I'm really looking for you so that I can talk to you and ask you for your permission and blessing to set up a tent somewhere, and we want to learn about the way that you guys live and talk to you about some things." But every time I tried to talk to him, he would interrupt me. They do this intimidating thing where they'll ask you a question and then interrupt you with another question while you're giving the answer. And so at one point I just said, "I could really answer your questions better if you would let me finish one." And he looked me up and down and shoved me. And so I pushed him back. And one of his guys caught him, and they all looked at each other and started laughing and slapping me on the back and telling me where to set up my tent, right? So this is a bunch of guys wearing skirts and carrying AK-47s and living out in the bush. I remember laying in my tent that night and thinking okay, this is what I was made for. This is all those reasons why I didn't fit in the Bible college dormitory, right? This is why. And so I spent a couple years there before we got married. By the time I got to South Sudan, I'd been a Christian for about 9 years. I spent most of that time in Bible college and seminary. I went to Calvary, and then I went to Midwestern. Moving into the dorm at Calvary Bible College when you grew up in a violent alcoholic family and just got saved 4 months ago is a really hard thing to do. And so I remember learning a lot of stuff about, Christian character in the Bible. And I heard things about humility and weakness. But then, reading passages like this one about Moses. And I was really confused because all of the guys that seemed to have all the friends and fit in really well were powerful and smart and handsome and smooth, and I really wasn't any of those things. So I tried to fit in, and I tried to be funny and charming like these other guys that I admired or secretly hated. But I never really could. On my first day of Bible college, I'd been a believer for about 4 months. I still had some pretty rough edges and really felt out of place and not accepted, not really as clean cut as some of these other guys. But that's why I fit in at cattle camp, with all these roughneck pagans, but not really with my own people. And so as I was reflecting on what to talk about this time around, and sort of what the Lord's been teaching me in the gospel, I was thinking back on some of that history and some of the things that I've experienced since then, and just how common that dynamic is and how incredibly wrong and devoid of the gospel it is at the same time. And so here's what I mean by that. Do you guys believe the gospel here? Is this right? You stake your life on it? Yeah? Everyone's nodding but one, but I won't point to him. Just kidding. If you really believe the gospel and are staking your life on it, I've got a little bit of bad news for you. Are you ready for it? There is something inherently and qualitatively wrong with you. At the very core of your being, you're broken and evil and sinful and wrong. And there's not a single thing that you can do to begin to even start to try and change that. I accidentally preached this at an Armenian church once and got in trouble. There's not a single thing you can do to even start to change that. If you believe the gospel, that's the first thing you're admitting, right? Admit. I saw it up here, right? That's the A, right? You can't get to B before you have A. That's the first thing you're admitting. The only solution to any of your evil and brokenness is the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the Spirit that He sends. Can we all agree on that? Do we all agree on that? Good. So the only option you have is to fling yourself at the foot of the cross and trust Christ for your righteousness and your sanctification, right? I just baptized my 9-year-old a couple weeks ago, and I promised myself I wouldn't cry. And we got out in the water. We're at Smithville Lake, and it's 50 degrees outside, and we're all freezing in the water. And I said, Ezekiel, why do you want to be baptized? And he said, Jesus Christ died for my sin and rose in victory over it, and now I'm hidden in him, and I want the whole world to know about it. He's 9 years old. I know 40-year-olds that can't explain that to me. And so that's the only option we have, right? For our brokenness and evil. And that's bad news for people who like to believe that they have it all together. It's bad news for those of us who have something to prove, right? Or who show up on Sunday to judge and feel superior, right? I talked about the church that I got saved in and then it split that night. This is where I was forged. So, see, if the church is a body of people who believe the gospel and are transformed by it, then we all acknowledge that we're only here because of a free gift that was given to us in Christ, right? Now, I go to a lot of churches. I get to have this sort of mile-high view because I'm in, 3 churches a week, which adds up to a lot of churches in a year. And a lot of places that I go, it's fun to sort of see the dynamics. In a place like this where you've got kind of a down-to-earth pastor who jokes around and knows who he is. But there's a lot of places that, this is like where we come to have it all together, and confessing your sins to one another and praying for each other like James tells us to just doesn't really seem like a safe thing to do. When what will all these people think if there's kids in the room? What will all these people think if I ask them for help with my internet addictions? Right? That's one that a lot of people can relate to. And so we don't talk about it because it's shameful and everyone might look down on me. So then I got to sit here and feel like I'm the only one struggling with this. And so is everybody else in the room. And ultimately, church just becomes a place where we all come to be alone together. I hope that's not what it's like here. How freeing is it when we all realize that we don't have to perform for each other and hide things? In fact, that's really an affront to Christ's gospel, isn't it? To the body. Now, of course, nobody's saying that it's okay to just sin and do whatever you want because we're all sinners anyways. That's just an error on the other side of the spectrum. Martin Luther wrote about it like this. He said, if you're a preacher of mercy, do not preach an imaginary mercy, but the true mercy. If the mercy is true, you must therefore bear the true and not an imaginary sin. God does not save those who are only imaginary sinners. Be a sinner and let your sin be bold, and let your trust in Christ be stronger. Rejoice in Christ, who is the victor over sin and death in the world. Right? So obviously the reaction to this is always, well, if you preach this like free grace gospel, then people are just going to assume I can go out and live whatever hedonistic life I want. I've rarely met the born-again person who thinks that. I more frequently meet the born-again person who still feels like they're being beat down by the law and by their own sin and somehow disqualified from ministry. And you know what? The fact that you're hidden in Christ and your righteousness comes from Him means that you can share the gospel with the guy at that gas station regardless of what just happened between you and your spouse 5 minutes ago. You're still qualified. Because when the Father looks at you at the end of the age, He doesn't see your weaknesses and failures. He sees the complete obedience and righteousness of Jesus Christ that was accomplished for you ultimately when He died and rose from the dead. And if we all come from a place of weakness and like gracefully receiving one another and building each other up, that's like real Christian body stuff, isn't it? So Jared Wilson is one of the professors at Midwestern. He wrote a book called The Imperfect Disciple, and he says it like this. He says, the gospel cannot make us into judges of others' ministerial output. It cannot make us people who keep sizing each other up, measuring each other, rehearsing each other's failings. It's not tuned to the frequency of accusation. Instead, we should become advocates for our brothers and sisters. If anything, we should be astounded that they let us into the community. Given what we know about ourselves, given that we are the worst sinners we know, it's a staggeringly arrogant thing to begrudge any other repentant follower of Jesus a place at the dance. If the bar was low enough to allow my entry, what advantage do I have in raising it? So at the beginning I read about Moses. This is all going to come together, I promise. I read about Moses. You know, he had a lot of excuses, didn't he? God said, I'm going to do this awesome thing through you. And Moses was like, God, I'm a nobody. I'm not qualified. You know, I don't really talk that good. And when I read this, I think I know what he's driving at. He wants God to say, you know, don't say that. You're awesome. I picked you because I need your amazing talents. You're strong enough, you're smart enough, and doggone it, people like you, right? But when I start listing my faults to God, I know that's what I want to hear from him. But God doesn't ever puff Moses up in this passage, does he? He doesn't raise Moses' self-esteem. He actually kind of confirms all the stuff that Moses just said about himself. God says, I made your tongue, I will give you my power, I will be with you. He's not trying to convince Moses that Moses is strong enough to do the job. He's telling Moses that God himself is strong enough to do the job. Right? Moses gets to be the bicycle. Right? Don't be afraid of your weakness. It's the only thing God has to work with. So I've been a missionary for 12 years, and sometimes, not sometimes, this really resonates with me. And sometimes I feel like I'm Peter, you know, like stepping out of the boat and then taking one look around and flailing around saying, Lord, save me. You know, it's interesting. We read that story and kind of laugh at Peter, but nobody else got out of the boat, right? And yet Peter's the one who feels foolish, kind of flailing around. And you know, I'm not really good at taking the junk that happens in our family and ministry every month and turning it into some encouraging hero story. Read my newsletters, right? He says he reads them. So after a couple years in cattle camp, I came back to the U.S., got married. When we went back to South Sudan, that's another long story. We had to change organizations. We went to a different part of the country, and it was a completely different kind of ministry. Now we're living in a village. We're learning a local language and doing evangelism, things that I didn't really feel so comfortable doing. You know, going out and just like making relationships with people, right? That's not something that I'm really good at doing. Like I said, no one believes I'm the intro. I've had to like learn how to do preaching and fundraising, and so no one really believes that anymore. I just have to keep telling you, like, I'm going to crash after this. Those are things I don't really feel that confident about. And so I secretly hoped that I could just go there and sort of work on the other missionaries' cars and like help them do their shopping and stuff. And then, you know, let the real missionaries go out and do all the people things. Because that's what I'm good at, but God wouldn't let me stay there. I did end up being the guy who did all the acquisition and car repairs and did all that stuff, but God wouldn't let me stay there. I had to start doing the things that I wouldn't naturally do and didn't really feel that good at, because there's lost people here that needed the gospel. And so we started studying language. I failed Spanish in high school. I failed Greek and Hebrew and found the master's degree that I could get without finishing them. I'm not good at learning languages, but we had to start learning the local language. And so I would get someone to come over and help me, and I have to like teach them how to teach me the language, because there's nothing written in our language. And so I would point to pictures and they would say the words, and I wasn't allowed to speak for the first like 2 months of lessons. I just had to listen like a baby does. And then, they would say, lean against the wall, roll on the floor, jump over the bucket, and I had to follow their commands, and just practice hearing. But once I would get someone understanding how to do the lessons, they would just disappear. People move from village to village and just like go to town and never come back. And so then I'd have to start over and start over. Well, finally it occurred to me, there's a guy sitting out at my front gate who's the guard. He keeps the kids from coming in and throwing rocks at my windows. And he's there all the time. And he kind of speaks good English too. And so I went out and got Michael. Do I have Michael here? Oh, I put that quote up there. I need to update my notes. So this is Michael actively guarding our front gate. If you look at my pictures out there, I've got a picture of our dog who was the real deterrent. But so I started getting Michael to come and help me learn language. And, after a year and a half of studying language with Michael, I was running out of things to do and I didn't really know what to do next. So I started recording sermons. I'll talk about Paul. Do I have Paul? There's Paul. We inherited Paul from a teammate that left right after we got there. Chuck had led Paul and his wife to Christ and baptized them. And when I started working with him, he knew 6 Bible stories, because that's all we'd really done with him. And he was going out as a translator, which doesn't really work, trying to teach through a translator. So I just started sitting down with Paul and basically teaching him the Bible. We did Old and New Testament survey and started talking about theology and basically doing Bible and theology training with him so that he could go out to the villages and just be the teacher instead of me having to do it and people trying to understand translation. Well, on Sunday mornings, I would record Paul's sermons and take them back to Michael and basically just listen to the sermons. And when I heard a word that I didn't know or a phrase that I didn't know, we'd stop and Michael would explain it to me. And we started learning language that way. Well, one day Paul preached a sermon on King Joash. So do you guys know who King Joash is? Can anyone tell me the story? This is the cool thing about just teaching somebody the Bible and then watching what the Holy Spirit does with his cultural insider, how things apply to him. King Joash actually was working really closely with the high priest and basically remodeled the temple. He's the one that put the box out to take collections and remodeled the whole thing, got Yahweh worship reinstated in Israel. And then the high priest died and he rebuilt the Asherah poles and the high places and all that stuff. And the high priest's son came to him and said, you shouldn't be doing that. So then Joash had that guy killed. And by the time Joash died, there was Yahweh worship in Israel again, but all these other things too. And he kind of died in disgrace. And so Paul tells that story and is talking to people that are at church on Sunday who are going to leave here and take their sick kid to the witch doctor, and talking about Jesus being the only way and that kind of thing. And so me and Michael are listening to this sermon and Michael starts getting really, really angry. Well, Michael's uncle is that landlord that I was telling you about. And so I said, Michael, what's wrong with you? And he said, well, that dude's basically saying we're all worshiping Satan. And so we went back. We'd already translated Genesis. We'd done all these Bible stories. So I said, well, let's go through all these stories and let's look at the way that God says do this, but then the enemy just sort of tries to, he doesn't have to get you to turn around and go the opposite direction. He just has to kind of get you off the path a little bit. I used to be a pilot, and that was the thing. If you were off by 2 degrees and you didn't realize it, next thing you know, you're way over here somewhere. That's all he's got to do. And I said, so what about it? We looked at creation and the fall. We looked at Cain and Abel. We looked at Noah. And he said, well, yeah, I guess. I said, is your uncle leading people to repent and believe in Jesus or something different? And he said, yeah, I guess my uncle really is distracting people from the gospel and probably a servant of the devil. And I said, okay, what are you going to do about that? And he said, I don't know. I need to think about it. Because for him, leaving the whole village system where he's a leader and following Jesus means basically giving up his whole life. You know, at Paul's house, every year they come by and say, give us money and food and goats. We're going to go pay homage to the Rainmaker. And Paul says, no, I'm not going to do that. And people actually like kick in his door and take whatever he has. And he just sits there and accepts it. And then Teresa, you know, here I am like task-oriented, logistics, you know, Justin, who's always trying to like get a lot of stuff done. And one day this girl shows up and she's like 10 years old and says, I want you to teach me the Bible. And I was like, okay, you know, everybody that walks into my compound and asks me that ultimately wants me to like give them money or something. Like it's happened hundreds of times. And so this girl walks in and says, hey, will you teach me the Bible? And I was just like, talk to my wife, I'm busy, you know, and I started fixing the car. And I go inside later and find out that Teresa's grandfather is the same village landlord who found out that Teresa had been going to the church, which there's a church in our village that doesn't really believe the gospel. It's another long story. It's not a Christian church, but there's a cross on the front, and so they call it church. And she had been going there hoping to learn more about the Bible, and when her grandfather found out, he threatened to like burn all of her stuff and beat her to death. And so she came down to my compound and asked my wife to start doing Bible study with her. And she, you know, what is this, 9 years later, calls me dad, like sent me a WhatsApp message this morning calling me dad. Like we've effectively, there's no legal adoption, but she's basically our daughter. I took her to Uganda last year to go to secondary school because when I got there, her uncle was actually walking around the village with a gun looking for her. She had turned down 3 arranged marriages. They don't like her because she's a Christian, and so they're trying to marry her to like a 60-year-old guy that already has 3 other wives, you know, and she just refused. And so her uncle decided she was doing a shameful thing for the family and he was going to kill her. And so he got up to my front gate with his gun, asked Michael, is Teresa in there? And Michael said yes. And so he reached around to unlock the gate and then jumped back and walked away. And Michael said, where are you going? And her uncle said, that gate just burned me. And he turned around and walked away. And I got there 2 days later. Like I flew from the U.S. and drove in 2 days later, and everyone's telling me these stories. And so we got Teresa to Uganda where she could actually go to school and sort of be safe from all of that while we're here. But the reason I'm telling you all these stories because people want to know what's going on with us. We've been in this tribe now for 10 years, and those 3 people are like all the fruit that we've seen. And this is a tribe that's had missionaries for 60 years, and there's like very little to show for it. And so as we talk about spiritual warfare and just loving people for the gospel and stuff, like I wanted to be a pilot, because so that I didn't have to deal with people, and I'm good at that kind of stuff, but I was too fat and colorblind and they wouldn't let me, and so I got stuck here. And none of these things would have happened if I hadn't just sort of embraced the weak, you know, parts of my life that I don't really want to do. You know, and so and it goes on from there. After living in the bush for 8 or 9 years, things changed in our family. We came back for a 6-month home assignment in September of 2019, right? October, November, December, January, March 2020, right? And so the time's up, it's time to go back, and all of a sudden nobody's allowed to travel, right? And so we were delaying a little bit. We were getting some counseling for my wife. There's a lot of stuff that I just don't talk about from up here that makes more counseling really necessary for her and for us. And living in the bush makes it even worse when you're hiding behind a shipping container while the villagers and soldiers are shooting at each other, and trying to keep your kids from running out, and she's already got all this like trauma and anxiety. And so we're getting some counseling for that. And then COVID shut everything down. And then, sometimes you go to counseling and you learn some new tools and kind of move on with your life. And sometimes you go to counseling and it just gets deeper and wider. And we've kind of been on that path for a while, to the point that a few months ago, our pastor said, you should probably just settle in for a couple of years. So now we've learned the language, we've got these 3 disciples, and now we're like fighting to get back, My wife is like talking to Teresa on the phone every day and like eager to go back, but recognizing that this is a necessary season for our family. And so that's kind of where we are right now. I've got 3 jobs all within the same organization, because I was back in our village in February and March, and now I'm here actually learning a whole new ministry that has to do with reaching Muslims in the United States and helping churches like this understand how to better do that. And then I'm also helping them develop a Salesforce platform, which is a computer programming thing that I don't know anything about and have to relearn. And so here we are. Like, our hearts are in Lopete with Teresa and Michael and Paul and the thousands of people who still need the gospel. And for some reason, for this season, God's just said, let's park here for a little bit and get some of these other things worked out that really need to happen. And so I get to just swim around in this like weakness and feelings of failure, and yet trusting the Lord and like seeing the way that He's overwhelmingly providing and making things work out. So that's the update. That's what's going on with us. What am I doing? We're learning to reach Muslims in the United States. I'm planning my next trip back, which probably won't be till next year. And really, what they've given me to do involves a lot of like back office. Don't spend a lot of resources out on people and just focus on like what your family needs right now. That's what they keep telling me, even though I've got all this other stuff I want to go do. And so that's where we are. We're going back to Lopete someday, but it's going to be a couple years. We're still doing ministry here in Kansas City. There's a lot of Muslims in Kansas City, a lot of refugees. And so that's where we are. Living in America is more expensive. I know your pastor talked about it a little bit. All of our support comes from people who heard us speak at a church and decided to give monthly. And so we've got donors. I don't spend a lot of time talking about support, but we need about $1,800 a month to cover people who had to drop off because of COVID things. And some people just don't think living in the U.S. and reaching Muslims for a couple years while you focus on family healing is as important, and have just stopped giving. And so we're asking people to pray about partnering with us that way. We've got monthly partners from $5 a month all the way up, individuals, churches. There is a clipboard right there. If you would take it and pass it around, there's another one right there. If you want to get on our contact list, we've got, that's the end. We've got monthly emails that go out. If you give me your phone number, I'm going to call you. And I say that because people get really mad when I call them, and I'm like, but you wrote your phone number down. And it's not because I'm a salesman or anything like that. My reality is, like, you go to work tomorrow and have a whole bunch of other life stuff that takes up your bandwidth. And so I just want to ask people to pray about partnering with us. And I want to be able to call you back in a week or two and say, have you had a chance to pray about that? Right? God's providing for us all, and some people can and some people can't. But yeah, that's it.
Can I?
Go ahead. I told Clayton I usually call him up at the end, and he said don't do that. But this is where I'm like, go ahead and talk.
We're going to do it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. You've been there 10 years. Does everybody know you in the village then?
Mm-hmm. I'm the only white person there. Everyone, yeah.
They know what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
You still have trouble breaking into that?
Because the gospel, when somebody tells you they're a Christian, what that means is, I don't drink anymore, I don't smoke anymore, and I don't dance at the funerals anymore, and I got a set of nice clothes to wear on Sunday. And when we started like studying the book of Galatians and talking about like what I just talked about, and grace and like faith and not just being saved by these 5 things that you can check off, the pastor got mad and walked out of my house. And so everyone, and somebody with a white collar on his neck stood up and told me I'm wasting my time doing evangelism because everyone in the village is already part of the church. So, you know, in our part of the world, you know, where there's a lot of Islam, Muslims are Muslims because they're born that way. You're born into a Muslim family, a Muslim country. That community is a really serious thing. And so when someone says Christian, it usually means not Muslim. And so people will say, I was praying in the mosque and the light-skinned Arabs came in and started shooting us black-skinned Muslims because they didn't like us. And I decided, if that's how Muslims are going to treat Muslims, I don't want to be a Muslim anymore, so now I'm a Christian. And so just getting people to understand that like Christianity is not something that you're born into, you know, and what it means to actually repent and be a follower of Jesus. It takes a lot of sort of tunneling through those calluses to get you there. So.
How many languages do you know? And now here's the reason let me ask you.
One point.
You have been in different places. Mm-hmm. Do they all speak the same language?
No.
Does every tribe have its own?
Yeah, every tribe. There's 87 tribes in South Sudan, and those are all unique languages. So I can speak a little bit of like 4 Sudanese languages. The only one that I can really sit down and have a conversation in is Lopit. So when I lived in Dinka, we started training the translator to be a teacher, and he knew English, and so we just did that, and then and didn't ever finish learning language. So, but so English and sort of Lopit, you know, yeah. But I can see the Sudanese people that work in Kansas City, and usually tell if they're from one of the 3 tribes that I've lived with, and have basic greeting type conversations. And people get really freaked out when you greet them in their mother tongue that they haven't heard in 10 years.
Pretty basic question. Is everybody Muslim?
No. In fact, South Sudan exists because they separated from Sudan when the government tried to impose Sharia. They fought a 60-year-long civil war to basically stop the spread of Islam. Really, it was more than that. It was just because the tribes wanted their own power. But South Sudan separated because when the government in Khartoum tried to impose Islam, they fought against it. So there is Islam and a lot of it, but it's all in the towns where there's markets, because all the people that own shops are from Darfur or Somalia, and so they've got mosques in the towns. But in the villages, Islam doesn't really exist yet. It will, but it doesn't yet.
That's what made me think about the girl being persecuted for being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a legal thing.
Right.
Family tribe.
Right. Yeah, I mean the tribal tradition is really a part of your like honor and shame and like your own personal family identity. So
Anybody
yeah.
have a question? No.
I don't have to be anywhere until tomorrow morning, so
There you go.
yeah.
I thought you were talking earlier about, I thought it was pretty cold of you, where the guy shoved you and you shoved him back. Now I'm thinking in my mind,
I just want to give this.
that's an opportunity to get booked right there.
Well,
But
we had some friends who were IMB journeymen and they were all girls, but they had spent about 8 months going out. They never slept in cattle camp because it wasn't really safe, but they would go out there and spend a day and then go back home. And so they told us a lot about what those guys were like, and I was like, oh, this is going to be fun, you know? And so I kind of knew already. She told me, when you meet the leader, he's gonna put on a show. And she said, that's all it is. It's a rooster show. And so don't back down. And I was like, all right, I can handle that, you know?
Well, we got a lot of friends, so that's,
Right.
that's pretty cool. But the thought that occurred to me in that, and I know we read this, we read this or misquote it all the time, was Romans 8:28, how God makes everything work together for his good.
Mm-hmm.
And all of your background and stuff that you said, well, you know, come to know Christ till you're 20, God takes all that and uses it out on the field. And
Yeah.
I just think that's God's amazing. So, anyway, just a couple things that came to mind.
Yeah.
All right.
You just want to pray and do whatever's next?
Yeah, let's do that. You want to pray?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. God, thank you for your gospel and the boldness that we can get from it and the certainty that we have in it. I pray that if anyone here doesn't understand that you would impress that on them and give them questions to ask. And Lord, ultimately that through us in this room and your body as a whole, that the gospel will go out and that you would be glorified. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Mike, you want to lead us? Maybe you didn't know there was a missionary